lion's ear, the bullet hissed, but my man just yelled back, "Motherfucker, you missed!"
If there ever was an example of a tortured genius, it would be in the form of someone who was rightfully credited as the father of horror and mystery in our modern day era. A man whose mind was swimming in the notions and ideas of the grotesque and the macabre. His everyday life every bit as chaotic as those of his fictional protagonists. However, instead of battling some supernatural entity or weaving his way through a twisted maze of murder, this old world gentleman battled the real-life demons of tragedy, disease, and abandonment. His everyday life an unending odyssey of just trying to seek acceptance from the harsh realities of the everyday world. Ladies and gentlemen, Penalty of Death Productions is proud to present to you the life and times of the master of horror, the proverbial goat in every sense. This is the one and only Edgar Allan Poe.
The man known as Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809, to Mother Elizabeth and Father David. Davis was a rough and gruff stagehand, while Elizabeth lit up the stage in front of the curtain as a headlining actress. When Edgar was barely a year old, David abandoned his family without warning, leaving Elizabeth to look after young Edgar and his two siblings, William and Rosalie. Back in the early 1800s, the vocation of stage actor was seen by the general public in a second-class status. Yet, despite this, young Elizabeth was much loved by her community. Her riveting and heartfelt performances left audiences breathless, and she frequently achieved standing ovations. Being the sole provider for her 3 children, Elizabeth went from performance to performance, with little breaks in between. Perhaps a combination of exhaustion and stress hastened what was to come next. Elizabeth eventually fell deathly ill, and before too long she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, known better back in the 17th century as the dread consumption. It was the one disease that loomed over Poe like a foreboding shadow of doom his entire life. He would eventually lose 2 mothers, a brother, and even his beloved wife to the devastating illness. When Elizabeth finally succumbed to her plight, she bid all of her children a tearful farewell, and although young Edgar was only 2 years of age at the time, this is probably the one memory that seared into his mind the rest of the time he would spend amongst the living. After his mother's passing, little Edgar and his siblings were split apart and sent to different foster homes. Edgar was eventually taken in by John and Frances Allan, Mrs. Allan herself, a self-professed fan of Elizabeth Poe. While Frances showered Edgar with attention and sympathy, John, on the other hand, always looked upon Edgar with subtle disdain, his choice to take the boy into his home, perhaps nothing more than an attempt to appease his doting wife. Poe and John Allan would spend the rest of their days as familial adversaries. Despite his mixed and contentious home life, Poe developed into a well-schooled and athletically gifted young man. At the age of 15, Edgar performed one of his greatest physical feats by swimming 6 miles against the current of the James River that earned him much acclaim around Virginia. As he continued into his teens, Poe developed what many scholars consider his first boyhood crush. The subject was a woman named Jane Steinard, who happened to be the mother of a close friend of Edgar's. The teenager, who along with his physical prowess had also blossomed into a hopeless romantic, spent hours pining over Jane, sometimes daydreaming for hours on end. This obsessive affection would become a hallmark for Poe's later romantic relationships. It was often said that he looked upon all women as angels of mercy, pedestalizing and revering them. The men in his life were seen by Poe in a much less favorable light, mainly due to his constant clashes with John Allan. Sadly, Jane Steinard died of cancer, robbing young Poe of what he would consider to be his first true love. Not too long after Jane died, Frances tearfully revealed that she too had been stricken with consumption, leaving Poe utterly devastated. Throughout her long bout with the illness, the rift between Poe and Mr. Allan only widened. John would frequently neglect his ailing wife, going so far as to conduct several extramarital affairs, while Frances crept closer and closer to death. This earned Allan the eternal ire of Poe, who vowed to never forgive the humiliation that John would routinely subject his wife to. The tension between Poe and Allan grew so severe that John ultimately sent his foster son away to the University of Virginia. Edgar objected, but was threatened by John that if he did not leave, he would be cut off from the family fortune permanently. Finally, seeing no other choice, Edgar relented. But John Allan was no one to be trifled with. He sent Edgar with just enough money to make the trip, with very little remaining for much of anything else. Poe's time at the university was fraught with hardship. Although the young man got along well with his classmates, the school in the early days of the 1800s was quite a dangerous place. Gangs of unruly young men wreaked havoc on the grounds routinely, and it is even rumored that one of the professors was viciously murdered by a disgruntled student. During this time of uncertainty and urgency, Edgar stumbled upon another long-dormant talent. As well as being a captivating poet, Poe was also an exceptional artist. This did little to provide for his more immediate needs, namely food and clothing, since Allan provided him with nothing more than train fare. Poe routinely used the wood from the furniture in his dorm room to burn as kindling just to keep from freezing. Looking for some other way to make extra money, Poe accrued major gambling debts. He was faced with a choice: pay up or be thrown into debtor's prison. Poe looked to Allan for some relief, but John Allan refused to cover his debts, essentially throwing young Edgar to the wolves. Poe fled the university under cover of night and belatedly joined the army out of desperation. During Poe's short enlistment of only 2 years, he learns that Frances Allan had died of her tuberculosis, once again emotionally gutting the young Poe. It was at the onset of Frances Allan's death that Edgar and John parted permanent company, the former vowing to venture out into the world and never look back. During this time of painful personal growth, another passion of Edgar's was steadily rising. He was desperate to get pen to paper and bring his wellspring of imagination to life. It was a fire that simply could not be extinguished. Poe spent an indeterminate amount of time wandering from city to city, doing odd jobs and able to scrape together enough meager funds to publish a book of poems, which saw almost no success at the time. In his wanderings, Poe lamented to several friends that he had been, quote, abandoned by 2 mothers and rejected by 2 fathers. Desperately searching for a safe haven, Poe would eventually end up in the home of his aunt Maria Clem. In the company of Maria and her young daughter Virginia, Poe finally felt a sense of belonging he had been lacking most of his life. Over time, he settled into a comfortable routine with his new family. But trying to make it as a writer was proving almost impossible, and Edgar once again found himself scraping for odd jobs, burdened with the fact that he needed to not only provide for himself, but his aunt and younger cousin. In the midst of his struggles to provide for his new family, Poe was unexpectedly called to the home of John Allan one final time. On his deathbed, Allan angrily confronted and threatened Edgar, saying that he considered him to be one of the most ungrateful brats he had ever had the displeasure of raising. Allan informed Poe that he would be left out of his will, and that Edgar was forever banished from the Allan residence. He was to never return. Edgar left and felt an odd sense of peace, knowing that a painful chapter in his life was finally closed. Later in 1835, Poe secured the position of chief editor at the newly created Southern Literary Messenger. At this point, Poe had churned out a number of his more famous stories, including The Telltale Heart and The Mask of the Red Death. Poe hoped this position as editor would get him one step closer at publishing success. Although he was successful at his duties, Poe would often time clash heavily with his superiors, and his work life was tenuous at best. Edgar also earned a reputation as being a scathing critic of other contemporary authors, including that of Henry Longfellow. It was always speculated that Poe's skirmishes with a multitude of other writers stemmed from his deep-seated hatred of John Allan. Poe's time at the Messenger took him away from the Clem home for many weeks at a time, and it was during one of these furloughs that Edgar received troubling news from his Aunt Maria. Mrs. Clem informed him that she was contemplating sending Virginia away to live with relatives because of the family's financial hardships. This sent Poe into a frenzy, for he admitted, somewhat disturbingly, that he had indeed fallen in love with his 12-year-old cousin. He pleaded with his aunt not to go through with it, even threatening suicide if she deemed to send Virginia away. After a good round of convincing, Maria relented and allowed Virginia to stay. After a long family discussion, Maria consented for Virginia and Edgar to be married. Virginia's name and age were falsified to avoid scandal. Even though it wasn't as bad as sibling incest, marriage between first cousins, although practiced, was still frowned upon by larger society, although it was more common in some regions than others. Despite the curious, and some would say, off-putting nature of the marriage, Edgar and Virginia were, by all accounts, a happy and devoted couple. Poe displayed the acumen of a loyal and affectionate husband. Now sporting a wife to support, Poe sought better employment, as he was just barely able to make ends meet with his job at the Messenger. In 1842, he secured a meeting with then President John Tyler for a possible government position. Inexplicably, he showed up to the meeting drunk and disheveled, and further ruined his chances by trying to solicit a magazine subscription from President Tyler. He would later lament to Virginia that he felt some deep-seated drive to self-sabotage, almost as if he was afraid of true success. Throughout all this, Poe's literary output continued. He penned such tales as The Pit and the Pendulum, The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Premature Burial. Through his stories, Poe struggled to find some kind of connection to the afterlife. His world was a mix of order, mostly provided by his wife and aunt, and the chaos of his financial and professional hardships. One fateful night in the summer of 1842, Poe would face an unspeakable horror that many have said was the beginning of his true descent into despair and madness. During a piano recital at the Poe residence, Virginia began to cough up blood, a grim sign that she too had been stricken with the dread scourge of consumption. It was as if the universe itself was mocking Poe, gleefully disdainful at his attempts to live any kind of a happy life. For the next 5 years, Virginia battled the disease, only her youthful state, allowing her to last as long as she did. Poe entered a state of miserable depression as he struggled to alleviate and make his wife comfortable. However, ironically, it was during this time of immense personal torment that Poe would achieve his highest acclaims of literary success. During the winter of 1845, Edgar Allan Poe published his most famous poem, The Raven. The script became an overnight sensation and was the talk of the town for months afterward. Poe was suddenly in instant demand at town halls and lecture forums, where he gave fascinating and riveting readings of the dour poem. Yet even though he had finally achieved the fame he sought, sadly, it would bring him no fortune. So ruthless were the publishing entities that set the terms for literary postings that they had secured any and all rights to The Raven, as well as other stories written by Poe. In the end, he received an almost insulting $14 for his masterwork. But the terrible climax of his own private hell was still yet to come, as Poe continued to struggle with his desperately ill wife. During the final few years of Virginia's life, Edgar sought solace with alcohol more and more. Despair, melancholy, misery, anguish, and a horrible anticipation had become the new norm for Poe. Finally, on January 30th, 1847, Poe would suffer his ultimate defeat. His wife Virginia passed away at only the age of 24. This sent Poe spiraling out of control. He would be heard on ever the countless night weeping at his wife's gravesite. Poe would only outlive his wife for another 2 years. That time, a mix of debauched alcoholism and rage-filled despair. In the fall of 1849, Edgar Poe mysteriously disappeared for over a week, until he was found wandering the streets of Baltimore in a semi-delirious state. Poe was incoherent, and even more puzzling, was wearing someone else's clothes. The beleaguered writer was taken to a nearby hospital, rambling a series of nonsensical phrases. He repeatedly referenced the name Reynolds, and it said that his final words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." Finally, on the morning of October 7th, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died, his cause of death penned as a combination of exhaustion, delirium, and alcohol-related complications. To this day, it is a baffling mystery as to what exactly happened to Poe in the days he was missing, and what ultimately led to his wayward death. As many would say, Poe simply wasn't long for this world. He had finally been reunited with his beloved Virginia.
Now, it's in my humble opinion that the world owes a great debt to the works of Edgar Allan Poe. His was a case of art imitating life. Or rather, was it the other way around? Now, maybe that's a metaphysical conversation best left for another time. However, as always with these biopics, we've one last bit of business to attend to. What are my personal favorites in the body of work of Edgar Allan Poe? These are my top 5 stories and poems from the granddaddy of mystery. Enjoy. Seen as his most seminal work, The Raven tells the story of an unnamed narrator who sits by his fireplace, lamenting the death of what is assumed to be his wife, a woman named Lenore. In the midst of his musings, a raven flies into his study during the dead of night. Not knowing what to make of this, the narrator jokes about the bird's presence, only to be shocked that the bird has the power of speech, but only ever utters one word, that of Nevermore. Whether the raven can truly talk or is simply mimicking a word it was conditioned to learn is a point of contention that the narrator ponders over. He switches from rational explanations to thinking that the bird is an evil spirit sent to punish him, or perhaps even a sign that he is never to be reunited with his lost love. At the end of the poem, it is left ambiguous to the bird's true purpose and origins, largely leaving it up to the reader's interpretation. Again, an unnamed narrator arrives to aid his friend, one Roderick Usher, who is suffering from a mysterious illness that has afflicted both Usher and his sister Madeline. Being the only two left of the Usher family, the narrator begins to explore the strange happenings of the old Usher mansion. Roderick expresses his concern that the house is somehow alive and is sucking the life out of both himself and Madeline. The latter dies, and this only exacerbates the odd hauntings of the mansion. Later during a storm, it is revealed that Madeline had been mistakenly buried alive, and she is left bloodied and bruised as she struggled to escape her tomb. When she reveals herself, Usher is literally frightened to death as she herself dies for real, a result of her exhaustion. The narrator flees the mansion only to see that the house itself has sunken into the nearby lake. Our main protagonist, a man named Prince Prospero, has walled himself and his elitist guests in an ivory tower abbey. They are trying to shield themselves from an enigmatic plague that is killing the peasantry down below. The prince and his guests are indifferent to the commoners' sufferings and intend to wait out the plague in luxury, believing themselves to be completely safe. During a lavish ball thrown by Prospero, he attempts to entertain his guests with a number of brightly colored rooms. During the festivities, several guests notice a frightening Grim Reaper-like entity dressed in a blood-spattered robe, haunting the outer rooms. Prospero is enraged that someone has entered his abbey without permission, and he pursues the phantom. Suddenly he falls dead, the other guests swarming in to tackle the entity. To their horror, they find that there is nothing underneath the mask and robe, and too late realize that this was a demonic personification of the very plague they sought to escape. One by one, they succumb to the horrible disease. Set during the terrifying Spanish Inquisition, we see an unnamed narrator being condemned to death for unspecified crimes. He faints and awakens in a pitch-black chamber. Exploring the chamber, he finds that he is unable to escape. After fainting a second time, he finds himself strapped to a wooden frame with an enormous razor-tipped pendulum slowly making its way down to eventually kill him. He engineers a narrow escape by using the aid of the various rats that scurry about the dungeon-like chamber. To his horror, the walls begin to close in, and he almost falls into the gaping pit at the center of the chamber. Just before he falls in, an arm grabs him, pulling him to safety. This is the French cavalry, and the Inquisition has fallen into enemy hands. An unnamed narrator recounts the tale of how he is slowly driven mad by his elderly employer's evil eye. The narrator insists that he is completely sane and that his actions are the result of his supposed over-acuteness of the senses, as he puts it. After being vexed by the old man's evil eye, the narrator is driven to a point where he can bear it no longer and decides to kill the old man to get rid of the eye. After tucking in the old man one night, the narrator bursts into the room and smothers the old gentleman, later dismembering him and burying him beneath the floorboards. On the morning after the murder, the police come calling, investigating the old man's disappearance. While trying to mislead them, the narrator swears he hears the sound of a disembodied beating heart that slowly starts to drive him mad once again. In a fit of rage and guilt, he admits that it was he that killed the old man to get rid of the evil eye. In actuality, just a benign glass eye that the narrator mistook for something supernatural. I don't think it has to be stated what an indelible mark the works of Poe had on my own life. He seemed to mix the dreary and the macabre with the deeper questions of life and death. His nightmares fed my imagination, along with millions of others. His short stories and poems have been translated into almost every language the world over, and I think we've become a more insightful society because of that. Edgar Allan Poe was a mirror into a tortured psyche, but acted as a reflection of the dark underpinnings that we all have. Now the bigger question is, can we come to terms with what Poe so boldly laid bare? I'll leave you with this quote and let you decide. Nothing further had he uttered, till a feather that he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. This has been Penalty of Death Productions. I'm Chris, and of course, as we always say around here, question everything and trust no one. Till next time.